Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Vuhledar section of the front line where the Russian offensive continues. In the southwest of Vuhledar, the Russians have stormed Prechystivka and have managed to capture more than half of the town. The Russians have moved through from the eastern parts, gaining a foothold on the heavy shelling of the town itself. The Russians managed to get a foothold inside the eastern parts of the town, and they continued pushing all the way to the central parts while heavily bombarding the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians in turn had prepared defensive positions and ATGM positions within the town and beyond it, hitting the Russians as they were advancing, but the Russians managed to break through these defenses and gain a foothold in the western parts of it after gaining control over the central parts. This means that the current situation is that the Ukrainians still are located in the western parts of the town, but due to heavy bombardment, it is likely that the Russians will be in full control of it soon. There is the Ashlahak river line here to the north of Prechystivka, which means that a Ukrainian withdrawal would either go to the village of Niva to the west or through the bridge here to the north to the fortified positions. It's likely that the Ukrainians will withdraw to the fortified positions to the north due to the close proximity, and the river line itself is insignificant as it is very shallow. This means that the Ukrainians would be able to cross over with their vehicles, with the infantry, without any issue, even if the bridge is blown. Similarly, the Russians can do the same. The river line itself is not an obstacle and can be regarded as a regular field. As predicted, the Russians with this push are looking to gain full control of Prechystivka and will likely push in the direction of Novokrenka and Niva from the south and from the east. The objective of the Russians here is to flank the city of Vuhledar, and in the northern parts an assault is starting in the direction of Vuhledar itself. Similarly to the push near Prechystivka, the Russians reached the outskirts of the town before storming it in a different assault, and it is likely the similar case here, where the Russians will look to gain control over the first lines and then push into the village itself. The village is not large, but there is an industrial area in the western parts and in the central parts, which the Russians will look to gain control of. Will likely be a push along the first line to the north and directly into the central parts and the Dacia area from the south, where the Russians will look to do a general push all throughout the village and then move on to the industrial area following the capture of the town. And this will lead to a complete physical cut-off of the supply road here along the coal mine and a close enough proximity to the road that they will have direct fire control of it, leaving only this road here to the west under Ukrainian control. And based on that, we see that the Battle of Vuhledar has definitely begun, with the fighting on the outskirts and on the near flanks of the city, and the strikes being targeted towards the supply routes. At the same time, we have this fire map here, which shows heavy bombardment of the city itself and the separate areas nearby. There's heavy bombardment in the direction here in the northwest along the village of Novokrenka and Encircled. This is likely targeted towards Ukrainian reinforcements being sent to defend Niva and potentially to counterattack in the direction of Prechystivka. We see general fighting here in the Vuhledar section of the front line. Moving on to the Siversk section of the front line, we see some movement here. The Russians managed to gain control over Vyemka. This led to the Ukrainians launching a counterattack from the fortified positions to regain control over Vuhledar and hit the flank of Vyemka. At the same time, the Russians actually pushed here in within Pischane, where they have managed to get control over the southern parts of the town and are moving in a northern direction along the railways and the town itself. So we see fighting is now taking place along both of the railways connected to Siversk from the south, where the Russians are advancing along both of these flanks, where the village of Fedorivka to the west of Rostolivka is in a position where they are well connected to both Encircled and Kusminivka along the western bank of the Bakhmutovka River, where the Russian positions in Sakliv and Seti cuts the connection between Prechystivka and Fedorivka. The Russians now, with the push in the direction of Pischane, will look to cut off the connection to the north. to which they will be able to do a river crossing and gain control of Fedorivka, solidifying their control here on the west of Rostalivka and allowing them to either launch an operation to the west or to the north. It is more likely that their objective would be to simply cut off the connection from the west to prevent a counterattack and the Ukrainians hitting their supplies for a push towards Siversk, and then continue to push along the southern flank of Siversk, where the objective is to bypass the defensive fortifications the Ukrainians have to the east of Siversk by advancing along the southern flank. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainian positions here to the east of Siversk are very powerful, but the Russians have been able to advance in the southern flank, which indicates that that is the weak point of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line. However, the Ukrainians are still using and taking advantage of the strong positions in the east to launch counterattacks, which limits the Russian ability to conduct their offensive operations, as they will be limited by having to both defend and attack at the same time. Further north in the direction of Belorivka, some positional fighting continues to the north of the village, which has led to a Russian advance in the heights and a foothold gained. This indicates that if further fighting is likely to take place here in the town of Belorivka, as well as in the Siversk front in general, where the activity has increased significantly over the past few weeks. In the Kupyansk section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians have counterattacked in the direction of Tabaivka. This is an interesting development because we see that the Russians have managed to push in the western direction from Pischane, well as in the direction of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the eastern bank of the Oska River line, and down south to flank the Ukrainian positions by Stelmahivka. So we see the main efforts by the Russians taking place here from the northwest of Pischane to the southwestern flank of it through Berestov and Vasilivske and then over to Stelmahivka along the Siversk River line. Russians are here looking to gain full control of the Siversk River line in the northern parts to push the Ukrainians back towards the Oska River line and launch an offensive operation on the eastern bank of it. Instead, the Ukrainians are trying to stabilize their positions by counterattacking Tabaivka, which is located at a difficult position. Tabaivka itself is located on the low ground, and the Ukrainian positions here to the northwest are on the high ground. The Russian positions west of Tabaivka were also located on the high ground, but that is at an even elevation with the Ukrainian forces. At the same time, the Ukrainians still had positions here with the fortified position to the north and the general forest lines. They were able to use that as a position where they could counterattack from and has managed to gain control over the heights here to the west of Tabaivka, weakening the northern flank of the Russians here near Pischane. The Russians would have to regain control over this direction and secure its flank if it wants to continue offensive operations in the direction of the Oska River line. Otherwise, the Ukrainians could cut off the supplies by flanking Pischane, and if they manage to gain control of Tabaivka, the Russians would have to resupply through the open roads. We currently see that there are two roads connected towards Pischane, and that is the positions with fortified positions of the Ukrainians here between Berestova and Pischane in the south. And then there is the road that goes through the northeastern parts of Pischane through Tabaivka. This means that if the Ukrainians regain control over Tabaivka, there would be no road for the Russians to resupply Pischane. This means they would have to resupply over the open fields, and this means that when the spring season begins, which it has with the start of September, the rain will increase, the humidity will increase, and the ground will turn muddy much quicker, which would limit the supply over open fields, and both sides would have to rely on the roads, which means that the Ukrainians would be in a position where they have significantly weakened the Russian positions in Pischane by hitting their supply roads and semi-encircling Pischane. The town of Pischane right now for the Russians is operationally encircled, as there is no supply road that isn't either directly under Ukrainian control or under Ukrainian fire control with the recent Ukrainian push into the northwestern parts of Tabaivka. This means that the Russian positions here in the western parts are in a very weak position and they risk complete encirclement. So the situation for the Russians in Pischane is very difficult with this Ukrainian counterattack. This means that the Russians would have to stabilize the position here north of Pischane, otherwise they could be physically encircled in Pischane. And that situation is very difficult for the Russians in this section of the front line, as to advance this much in the Pischane direction, it is likely that they have used a significant portion of their forces to push towards the Oskar River line, and without securing their flanks, it is a very risky maneuver. This means that the Russians would here either have to flank the Ukrainian flanking attack by hitting them in the rear from Prechystivka and pinching them with that connection from Pischane to gain control of the fortified position along the highway and to cut off the Ukrainian forces near Tabaivka, securing the northern flank, or they would have to secure the southern flank, or do both really, would strengthen their positions the most by securing both supply lines. Would have two supply lines in and out of Pischane, and they can strengthen their offensive operations towards the Oskar River line, and at the same time push towards the second Pischane in the north along the railways and gain control of the point of Silivka. Otherwise, they would risk falling into a very difficult situation here in the Kupyansk section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out our Patreon for additional content. And check out my guide on the war in Ukraine if you have any questions with regard to my mapping or the frontline situation.